I'm Ken Root. I started at WKY-TV in May of 1974, and I was there until August of 1980. I am a farm boy, an Oklahoma State graduate. I was a vocational agriculture teacher. My interest, of course, has been that I started watching Channel 4, WKY-TV, in 1956, and then in 1974, I was able to be employed at age 24. And it was a lot different world on the inside than it had been looking through the glass from the outside. I met some most interesting people, to say the least, many of which I would remember and have stories about, but I'll discuss a few of them with you. Of course, I have to say, first of all, that Russell Pearson hired me. And Russell is known as he is a very stern, straight Baptist man, just turned 100 years old, and that's why I'm in Oklahoma City. But Russell called me after I had gone in for the first interview to come back, and he said, bring your wife. So he told me that his wife was going to be with him, and so Gail and I went in at 24 years of age, and my wife, when we walked in, she said, you realize your career is in my hands, don't you? So we were very gracious, and we sat down with Russell and Bernice, and Russell bought 4 cups of hot chocolate at a dime apiece out of the machine there in the vending area, and told me that he'd like for me to go in and do some video in the studio. And so I went in the studio in the early afternoon, as I recall, and some questions came down from above, and I answered those, and I read some script. There were no teleprompters at the time. And so we came out of the room, and Russell talked to me a while, and I found out that he wanted a person who was an Oklahoma State graduate, a native Oklahoman, married, and had worked with young people. And so I fit all of his basic criteria, and so he offered me the job that day for about $11,000, and I took it. Now, I was a vocational agriculture teacher at the time, and had I remained a VOAG teacher at UConn, I would have taught Garth Brooks. So it was an interesting twist, but I would have probably made Garth Brooks into a welder, so he might not have had the career he has if I'd been his teacher. When I came into WKY, it was just the most amazing place I'd ever seen, because I had an agriculture degree. I understood agriculture up to a point at being that young, but I really didn't know anything about television. And the farm department shot film, and Russell came out of extension. And so when he gave me the film camera, which was the old DR-70 wind-up Bell & Howell with the turret on the front, he said, here, I want you to shoot some film. And I said, how? And basically his only instruction was that after you had loaded the film, you made sure that if you were inside, you had the filter out, and if you were outside, you had the 85B filter in. And I found out that Russell didn't think it was a good shot unless your feet were in it. And so he shot very, very wide, and he shot very little film. And so the first story that I edited was one that he had shot, and he wrote the script. And all I was to do was to take his script and match that with this film, and we would then run it while he read that on the air. Well, it turned out to be that reading it, it was taking him about 2.5 minutes. And I ran out of film to be able to cover all of this. And he said, there's something wrong. He said, I shot 3 minutes of film. Well, in our news business, you know, we normally shot about 5 to 1, as I learned it later on. But I found out in my first story that Russell just basically spliced leader on both ends and ran it. So we began to work on trying to improve the quality of our film, and I ran into some rather harsh criticism of us from the news department, from Daryl Barton primarily, in good fun, but said that we shot crap, which we did. And so I began to try to improve the quality of our film through the time that I was there. But Barton was a fascinating guy. He was an extremely talented guy, in many ways, but his focus on video or film and working with Bob Dotson, they produced some magnificent work. But I got to know a lot of other people in the newsroom, and of course the news director was Ernie Schultz, who was a character all on his own. Ernie had been there 25 years when I came, and he did the noon news at that time, but he had other people doing the mornings, and then Ernie basically ran the news operation. And he was tough at times, and he really made people jump, but he brought in a lot of talent that did very well after their few years of their graduate degree at WKY Television. Jack Ogle was the evening anchor, the 6 o'clock and the 10 o'clock anchor, and George Tomac was there as an anchor as well. And it was great fun to be with that crew and just to see how the operation worked. Well, Russell obviously did a 6:30 to 7 a.m. farm show that I'd watched for many years, but again from the other side. And we had to be there at 3:30 a.m. And Russell was at his best at 5 o'clock in the morning because we ran hard getting everything ready so that we could produce that show at 6:30. We had a crew that came in. And one of the interesting things about the crew itself, the people that others never saw, was that they were quite the characters. And when, of course, as a child watching that station, I remembered a lot of things of the 3D Danny show and of the Foreman Scotty show. And so this little man, who was as cute as he could be, introduced himself as the director. He said, "My name is Billy Nix." And I kept thinking about that for a few days, and I went up to him and I said, "Billy Nix." I said, "Foreman Scotty used to say when the magic lasso was to appear, 'Nix-o Billy.'" And he said, "Yeah, that's right." He said Steve Powell came in one day and he had this slide that had this little magic lasso on the slide, and he said, "Put this in the film chain, and I want them to take the camera and wave it around over the kids and then stop it on one of the kids, and then we'll give that kid this horseshoe that I spray painted gold." And so Billy, as Steve ran out to do the show live, said, "How will I know what my cue is?" And Steve said, "I'll think of something. You'll know it when you hear it." And so from that came Steve Powell, Foreman Scotty, saying, "Nix-o Billy," and that's where that was born. And those words had stuck with me all of those years after that. Our audio guy was Roy Ramirez, who was dangerous, to put it mildly. He didn't have enough to do with his creative mind, and so he did other things as well. And he would screw you up sometimes just for the fun of it, which was to the delight of the rest of the crew, although they were much more low-key than that. And so Roy and I had our times, but I saw him at Russell Pearson's 100th, and we had a great reunion. But Roy would write copy for the Wallace Wildlife Show promos, and one of them was, "Catch your limit of fish and more with dynamite. Learn how on the Wallace Wildlife Show Tuesday at 6:30. Or learn how to field dress a game ranger," or whatever it may be. And then he would also take the company directory, and around everybody's picture he would draw a character. And he drew Billy Nix with little wings on him and a little halo. And he drew one guy who was real heavy with a crane tipping over on him. And so that part of the crew, John Weissmuller, and then on the other side of the hall, Gene Schaus, were most interesting people and very good in their profession. But again, in that early morning crew, they were kind of bored half to death. I worked with news people that came in, and probably the most prominent of the bunch was Pam Henry. And Pam was a beautiful young woman, and Pam was always so pleasant and smiled at everything. And I recall one morning she came into the newsroom and was in the chair there, and so Russell was doing the lead-in to her. And he said, "You know, Miss America was here in Oklahoma City just the other day, and she's back with us this morning." And Pam says, "Thank you, Russell. There were 2 rapes and a murder in Oklahoma City last night." Pam Henry was in the newsroom every morning, and she she was a pretty good partier at the time, and she was also single and dating people. Even dated the governor after his divorce, I think once or twice. And she was not always the most awake at that time. And so I realized that. So I would sneak in and surprise her. And I did it once, it got a big laugh out of it, and so I did it again thinking she would catch on, and she jumped just as much. And every time that I saw her, even though she knew I was going to be there, she still jumped. So we became good friends and had a great time. And every once in a while she'd say, if you'll fly, I'll buy. And so I would run up and get coffee for us and then run back down. So I would fly and she would buy, and we had an awfully good time. Russell Pearson learned in the early 70s that farmers wanted to travel. And the deal you work with a travel agent is that you have 20 or 40 people, and if you get that many, then you get to go for free. So Russell started doing that very successfully through the 70s, and I've said since that Russell Pearson has been around the world more times on somebody else's money than a shuttle astronaut. But he kept doing these tours, but sometimes he'd get so many people that he let me do one. So I would take a trip to the Caribbean, or I would take a trip somewhere else. But early on, he took them himself. And when he was gone, he felt obligated to send in something. Well, if he's on a ship or something like that, he couldn't send any video in because sending film at the time was very difficult to do. It was something you did only from the Olympics or from some big convention. So he would send audio, and he would send it to the radio side, and the radio side would record it on a reel-to-reel tape. Then they would leave it in the radio control area most of the time. But every once in a while, they wouldn't leave it there. They would take it down and leave it at the front desk, not knowing where television was. So if I couldn't find it, I was in trouble. So one morning, I'm looking and I'm looking and I'm looking, and there's nothing in from Russell. I knew there was supposed to be something in from this trip to Florida he was taking. Well, as it turned out, about 6:29 before our show started, I went out front and looked on the front desk of the television station, and there it was. So I had about 6 or 8 slides of Russell that would be the video portion of this, and I had the audio. So I took the audio over and had Roy Ramirez cue it up because we were going to play it during the show. So we never previewed it. Well, Russell, of course, never swore, so that wasn't an issue. But Russell, on that one, and the only time that he ever called one in, he had to stop and cough. And so he was talking about alligators, and then he stopped, and he cleared his throat, and he said, Ken, I'm going to have to start this one over again. Let me go back to the front of it. Well, that was live on the air. So we just had to play it on through. And so at the end of it, here I stand, with the crew laughing and laughing that I played this outtake. And so all I could say was, I think that alligators will be having a nice meal of me just as soon as Russell finds out about this. Norman Bagwell was the general manager of WKY Television when I was hired, and he was an old FBI agent. He smoked cigars, and he had a very interesting look at his eye, and he could kind of size you up. He was a very people-oriented person, though, and I recall I had only been there a very short period of time, and they had a wreck of the big mobile unit. They pulled out on the interstate, and it was hit by a milk truck and basically cut the truck in half, and there were just cameras on the highway, and it was a $1 million wreck for the station. And so they spread the word through the station that day that they were going to bring all this stuff back in. So being a farm boy, I went out, and as soon as the trucks would come in, I'd just take everything off the truck, and they'd run back and get more. I'm carrying these $100,000 Marconi cameras around, and they were broken, but we were just moving them to wherever we could. So they scrambled and they did amazing things to get their mobile unit back up and running, and it was about 4 or 5 days later, and I happened to be up on the second floor, and I went by Mr. Bagwell. I was with Russell. And so Mr. Bagwell, as soon as we walked by, he said, "Root?" And I just froze. And he said, "You're doing a good job. Thank you for your help." And I was amazed at what that meant to me. at 24 for a person like that to do that. And over time, I got to know him, of course, better and understand him. And Russell always felt that he was obligated to go in and explain to Mr. Bagwell what he was going to do when we went to Chicago for this extremely expensive trip. And I recall that Mr. Bagwell would actually chuckle about this because he thought it was funny, and sometimes even bring in Joe Jerkins and have him set in there to listen to this. So we're in there, and Russell is saying, and Mr. Bagwell, we don't buy milk from the hotel because they want like $2 for a half pint. And Norm said, well, by God, Russell, you could buy good hooch for that. And of course, Russell just shuddered to think that anybody would think of serving hooch to these young people. But he would just goose him just a little bit because I think he admired Russell greatly for how sincere he was and that he would never spend any money unless he had to make sure that they were going to approve it ahead of time. Well, Don Wallace was transitioning when I was there from doing radio to doing television. And so when we moved into the new information wing, Don was strictly television at that point. And Don was in a midlife crisis, so to speak, and he and his wife divorced, and he was pretty footloose and fancy-free. And Wallace also just loved to party. And he had all this energy and this humor, and so he would get you to go with him because he didn't have any crew to shoot this half-hour-a-week wildlife show. If you consider how much work it was to get a show like that together, it was really difficult. And he shot it, almost all of it, with a silent Scoopik camera, which was the next generation past the wind-up cameras. And if you'd go with him and you carried a CP16, you could then shoot sound film and he could have a better show. But when you went out with Wallace somewhere, the joke always was the hardest part of the Wallace Wildlife Show was pouring the beer in the Dr. Pepper cans. And then along with that, you had to make sure Wallace was ready to go the next day. So one night in Canada, Wallace, with no darkness, was partying quite heavily. And so the next day they said, we're going to start fishing at 1 p.m. Well, at 1 o'clock or at noon, there's no Wallace. So I go find him. He's not in good shape at all. And so I woke him up, and he's just in bad shape. And I said, we got to fly in this airplane, which he hated to fly in small planes. And we've got to get to this lake. And we've got to get in the boat and start trolling. And they say 1 o'clock is when the fishing begins to be good. So I see him about 30 minutes later, and he has a cap on that is silver. And he has a coat on that is silver. And he has a bright red top on, and it has red pants on and red and white tennis shoes. He looked like if he had had a hook in him, you could have just trolled with him. So we get in the boat, and he just lays down. He sleeps in the plane. Then he sleeps in the boat. So I am sitting there with the camera. I have my headphones on. I have my camera in my lap because it's film, so you can't be shooting until you've got a fish. And I am trolling for him. And pretty soon I get a rather strong hit. And I said, Wallace, I got a hit. So he jumped up, grabbed the pole, set the hook, reeled the fish in, did a magnificent job pulling that fish in the boat, held it up for me to see, and then he said, turn that thing off. I turned it off. He fell into the bottom of the boat and laid there for like 15 minutes. We went back out, trolled in some more, picked up another fish, and he'd go right back to the same thing. So he slept between fish the entire day. And when I edited that show, there was not a single thing you could tell other than the perfection of being able to catch the fish and bring it in and show it off. And of course, when he did his narration over it after we got back home, it was wonderful. He was a true talent. When WKY was a news department, they had the foreign department outside of it. And so Russell was standing alone, and the weather department stood alone, and the news department stood alone. But when they merged all of them together, Ernie Schultz became the head of all of information at the station. And so I then started answering to Ernie because I was the television farm broadcaster. And we had rather substandard equipment, to say the least, in the farm department. Nothing had really been updated until I got there, and I got a silent Scoopik, and then I really wanted to get equivalent equipment to the news department, and that way we could hopefully shoot equivalent quality of film. So I went into Ernie and I worked up a budget and had it ready to propose, and he said, well, you'll have to give this in front of the executives of the station. And so I walk in the door upstairs in Mr. Bagwell's conference area, and here is Ernie down at the end, and Mr. Bagwell and Joe Jerkins and Tom, I can't think of Tom's last name, who was up there as well, and a couple of other people. And so I went through my list that I had made copies of for them, and I wanted a CP16 camera, which was the film camera of the day. I wanted a new tripod, I wanted a set of lights, and I wanted a shotgun microphone. And so once I presented that, Ernie immediately said, you know, they have had substandard equipment for years, and if you can't buy them equipment that's equivalent to ours, I quit. And he jumped up. And so Joe Jerkins said, sit down, Ernie, we'll buy them that equipment. And I was just astounded. And so they thanked me, and I walked out, and Ernie came running out the door, and he said, Ken, is that all you wanted? I could have got you a bunch more crap if you'd have wanted it. And the whole story was that apparently in every one of those meetings, Ernie threatened to quit. But in the era that was there, it was just the relationship of all of that group of people, and they had the money to spend, and they knew that news department would deliver. And so I got my camera, and for the next 4 years, I was trying my best to be equivalent to the newsroom in quality of the work that we did. And as I recall, the last year I was there, they made their submission to the Kodak News Film Station of the Year, and one of my pieces was in there. Well, I stayed at WKY Television and then KTVY for 6 years, and in 1980 I moved to Oklahoma State University for 6 months in radio and television. Then I moved to Kansas to an agricultural news network for 3 years, and then I moved to Western Kansas to a television network for 3 years. And Steve Ramsey, who had been in news in Oklahoma City, was my news director there. And we turned the station from third to first in a year, which was a truly remarkable thing. And then Ramsey took off to many other stations across the country. I wound up going to New Jersey to work for American Cyanamid, Washington, D.C. to run an association of fertilizer chemical dealers. And then I moved back to Kansas City in radio, and I started a radio show called AgriTalk that was probably the highlight of my career for 7 years, doing talk radio about rural America. And then following that, I became the executive director of the National Association of Farm Broadcasters. And then following that, I went to Iowa to WHO Radio, which was still a big boomer, and stayed there until Clear Channel terminated me. And now I am on WHO TV, which is a sister station to KFOR, co-owned by them, but I'm in Des Moines now on an HD station, 3 letters, WHO. So I started at WKY, and it appears I'm going to wind up at WHO. I'm in Des Moines. If you're ever there, come see me.